So the new work operating would say, if the old one was work is a job, a worker is a job holder, and qualifications are degrees, the new one would say work is tasks, gigs, projects, etc. The worker is an array of capabilities, and the learning is in the form of, we might say, experiences, qualifications, etc. And a new operating system would let all those melted pieces reconfigure, match up on their own, so you could have a person with this capability matched to this project without necessarily wondering, how do we make that into a job? How do we make them into a job holder? That's kind of the idea.
Welcome to the Warriors at Work show. This is Jeannie Coomber, your guide and host. This is a show for men and women in the workplace who want to move from the predictable to the potent. This is your weekly dose of inspiration with an edge. I talk with CEOs and shamans, sports marketing executives and therapists. All of us are like-minded thinkers and doers who tell stories, share wisdom, and challenge each other to have the best life possible inside and outside the office. Welcome to your Warrior Conversation. Hey everybody, it's Jeannie. Thank you so much for joining me at the Warriors at Work show. Today, we are talking about rebooting the workplace with Dr. John Boudreau. Dr. Boudreau is recognized worldwide as one of the leading evidence-based visionaries on the future of work and organization. He's known for his breakthrough thinking and research on work, human capital, leadership, and having a competitive advantage. He's produced over 200 publications, including more than 10 books. His research has been featured in Harvard Business Review, The Wall Street Journal, Fortune, and Business Week. He's also a professor emeritus of management and organization and a senior research scientist with the Center for Effective Organizations at the Marshall School of Business, University of Southern California. So why am I having a conversation about rebooting the workplace? All of the conversations I'm having with clients and organizations is all around what's next. What is the workplace going to look like? How do we ready ourselves for this? What are the changes we need to make? And John has a fascinating perspective that is steeped in research and practical ideas. And we talk a lot about it through the lens of his experience, but also through his newest book, Work Without Jobs, How to Reboot Your Organization's Work Operating System. And we have a conversation about not completely rehauling your organization, but doing what he says, which is meeting the energy where it is. How do we play with systems and questions and frustrations and wherever you're having energy right now that you want to look at through a different lens? This is an absolutely fascinating conversation with so many practical tips and ideas and questions for you to ask yourself, whether you're head of people, head of a business, CEO, an entrepreneur. This conversation goes for anybody in the workplace. Be well. Welcome, Dr. John Boudreau. It's so lovely to have you in this conversation with me about the future of work. I'm so thrilled to get into this with you.
Me too, Jeannie. Thanks for the opportunity.
You have such an interesting background, and you're one of the world's leading evidence-based visionaries on this idea about the future of work and organization. So where I would love to begin is why this work? Think of all the careers that you could have pursued. Why did you choose this one?
It's a great question. I'll give you a couple of vignettes. It's interesting you say that. In the 70s, when I was finishing up my undergraduate education, and I had become fascinated with behavior at work and the idea of empowering workers, and at that time stopping the assembly line in Japan to let the workers do quality fixes, etc. And I went to my professors and I said, I'm really fascinated with this. And I said, what do you think I ought to do? And they said, well, you're a very good student, and being a good student doesn't predict much, but it does usually predict that you might be a good professor. And so would you have any interest in that? And I said, oh, that looks like a pretty good job that you have. And off to the races we were. So I started, basically looking around for programs that would get me to being a professor of work in probably human resources back in those days. And found Purdue University, which also had an MBA that you could get in a year on the way to the PhD. And my mentors in undergrad were also very clear that an MBA is going to be a really good qualification to have if you want to do this thing called human resources, kind of earlier on. A lot of people were doing, which is perfectly good. Industrial psychology was the typical program, and Purdue had a combination of business and industrial psychology and economics, and that's kind of how I got started.
Terrific. Well, speaking of HR, being that this is the space that you really have deep expertise in, and you shared something with me that I thought would be an interesting place for us to begin. You said HR right now, human resources, has wind in its sails. Say more about that.
Well, I think it's almost impossible to miss it, even if you're not in HR, how much more stature, how much more visibility, how much greater demand, how much more attention this world of certainly the work relationship, whether we call it future of work or hybrid work, whether it was motivated by COVID or Black Lives Matter, George Floyd, et cetera. I think almost everyone would agree that this thing called HR in organizations has gotten a lot more attention from leaders outside of HR, boards, CEOs, C-suite leaders, line leaders, in part because HR has raised their hand and taken on some of the accountability for things like rearranging work in the face of a pandemic, taking on the discussability of difficult issues among different groups at work, et cetera. So to me, we've had lots of articles that have often said, remember how the finance profession was kind of the savior of organizations during the financial crisis of 2007, 2008. Is there a parallel here with the HR organization, HR leadership, CHROs being the people who are going to navigate us through this crisis?
Which is so interesting, right? It's on the forefront of everything that organizations are thinking about. It's like, how are we going to prepare for the return, for the hybrid, for the virtual working model? What are we going to do to double down on talent and people, but yet still maintain our transactional bottom line, which I know we're going to get into, which is a perfect segue to talk about your book, Work Without Jobs, which is fascinating. Work Without Jobs, How to Reboot Your Organization's Work Operating System. And you and your co-author, Raveen, propose a radically new way to look at work. And we all know the term job and job holders, but you and your co-author have like a whole new operating system model that I would love for you to expand upon.
Well, thanks. Yeah, I'm happy to do that. And again, thank you for mentioning. All due credit to my good friend and colleague, Ravin J. Suthasan, who's the lead author on the book. And I encourage everyone to look him up and follow him. He's doing a terrific work at Mercer and with the World Economic Forum related to, but also independent of the work that I'm doing with him. So be sure and look Ravin up. And thanks, Jeannie, for kind of the plug about the book. It's called Work Without Jobs. And there's a webpage, workwithoutjobs.com. Okay, with that out of the way, the idea in the book was motivated by a kind of a series of triggers that we started to detect as we worked with companies. I'll get into them maybe a little bit later, but it's things like we're trying to be agile and we just can't seem to move fast enough in terms of who we hire, how we define the work, what people do. A lot of people saying, but it's not my job. That kind of thing got us thinking about some of our writing before. We've done, I think now 5 books together. And one of the things that was at the heart of almost all those books, whether it was automation or gig workers or freelance work, et cetera, one of the things that was at the heart of those was we really couldn't see the pattern unless we could see within the job. So automation very seldom neatly lifts people out of a job and puts a robot in there or AI in there. What you end up with more frequently, much more frequently, is combinations of automation and people. And you can't really see the automation effect unless you're willing to take those parts of the job, tasks, et cetera, and look at those and see whether they'll be automated, whether they'll be augmented, whether they'll be transformed. And in fact, of course, all the research on whether robots will take your job actually had to go down to the task level to estimate the automation. And then they pick kind of an arbitrary thing like, well, if 70% of the tasks in your job look like they're likely to be automated, we'll say then a robot could take your job. But the more interesting analysis is at that task level. So that's one example. And that got us thinking we probably want to write a book about the idea that thinking about work as the elements of jobs instead of as encapsulated in jobs, thinking about workers as a full array of capabilities within and beyond the job they hold. So instead of being a job holder, let those capabilities in a way melt out of the ice cube that would be job holder. And then the same thing with learning, which is often encapsulated in an ice cube, a kind of 0-1 thing. You either have a degree or you don't. Increasingly, we and others have been talking about skills or other elements of degrees as the elements of learning. So the new work operating would say, if the old one was work is a job, a worker is a job holder, and qualifications are degrees, the new one would say work is tasks, gigs, projects, etc. The worker is an array of capabilities, and the learning is in the form of, we might say, experiences, qualifications, etc. And a new operating system would let all those melted pieces reconfigure, match up on their own, so you could have a person with this capability matched to this project, without necessarily wondering, how do we make that into a job? How do we make them into a job holder? That's kind of the idea.
That's fascinating. Do you think the term job is going to become obsolete?
It's a good question. And I think it goes to one of our favorite quotes, which is that the future is unevenly distributed. So I think we're going to have jobs for as long, I think we'll always have jobs. And so the book title, well, I'll admit it, it's a little bit aggressive to say work without jobs and make it sound like the whole work ecosystem is going to let jobs go. I think more what it is when I talk about unevenly distributed, there are lots of places right now where you can see the edges of this job-based traditional work operating system. I mentioned automation. You see it increasingly with COVID, where you need to deconstruct and reconfigure work because part of it can be done at home, part of it needs to be on site. We talk about today, one of my interests is the transfer of all this flexible thinking to people that have been lumped into on-site workers. And what we see, you saw it in the railroad strike most recently, is that there's a great deal of flexibility, even in a role that might be on site, but to see it, you need to almost break the role up, that certain parts could be done from home, even if you're something like a lab technician or maybe even a retail associate who could work partly remotely. So the idea here is that these triggers, automation, trying to be more agile, new priorities, bottlenecks, etc., those are often places where the leaders and the workers are not yet asking for the Jesu Thas and Boudreau new work operating system. I hope they do one of these days, but right now they don't. They're not going to come and say, please give me a new work operating system. That's not how it works. But what they will say is, we can't hire fast enough. I can't upskill fast enough. These people are telling me it's not their job, but I need them to flow to the work more than they are. That's we're trying to automate, and I thought I was going to just give you back these FTEs to redeploy, but I still need those people. And how do I figure this out? And what we find is if we just allow them to imagine that they weren't constrained by making everything into a job and assigning a worker to job holder, those edges would be easier to optimize, easier to manage. So I think we're going to see it happening at these edges, where that's really needed, where the energy's already there, but people don't know what to look for. And then as work evolves, I think we probably will see an increasing amount of work that is better handled with the new work operating system than the traditional one, but by no means a total switchover.
Right.
And it's not necessary to switch over in your organization. it isn't necessary to switch the whole system over. You find the energy points and you start experimenting there.
I love that phrase, find the energy points and start experimenting there, because my brain immediately went to, the typical organizational or corporate structure is job description, distributed, attracts worker fits to job description, and then that's the box they play in.
Yes.
What you're saying is, what's the work? What's the demand? What's the project? What's the need? What's the skill? What does the talent look like that could match that? And maybe it's even over like a project scope, and then they could get redeployed into something else. I mean, it's so fascinating. So fascinating. Because, the other thing that I was thinking about with your work is, a lot of heads of people and heads of talent and business leaders listen to these conversations, and they might be listening right now going, okay, I hear what he's saying. I hear energy points. I hear triggers. All of that you just shared resonates. How would they begin to get their arms around this? Where would you play in to guide them?
So I think if you look at the real practical way that Robin and I, much more Robin than me, because he and Mercer are really out in the field doing work on this, and they've got obviously scale and scope. And I think what we see is the first step really for a head of talent or a CHRO working with their leadership team. Maybe they've all read this book, okay, what do we do? I think the first step is to step back and ask really a pretty simple question, which is, where are we getting signals that the work system isn't operating the way people would like? And in the book, we talk about several triggers, bottlenecks, like we can't hire enough people or our supply chain is changing. Another one is agile. We're trying to be very fast, move faster, transform faster. And if we have to keep writing job descriptions and wait for job holders, we just can't go there. A lot of the CHROs that have read the book have said, I now realize that it was jobs getting in the way as we try to do agile. Automation, I've talked about that quite a lot. New work arrangements, people want to work from home. They want to have more flexibility in their time. They want to take some time off and come back. Perhaps you've got great talent out there that would prefer to work as a gig worker, a contractor, or a freelancer. Increasingly with COVID, we're seeing those options more accessible and more acceptable to leadership teams in the same way that remote work is. Before COVID, look at my experience wasn't, and this is all fine, but in 2019, I went to the dean of my school and I said, look, I'm not going to commute back and forth to LA from Santa Fe, New Mexico, where I live. And this was May of 2019. I have an interesting idea. I've been doing these video seminars for a couple of years from Santa Fe. Why don't we do a hybrid thing? And I'll come in, every third week, but otherwise I'll teach remotely with the students. And the dean quite rightly said, it's probably going to be 10 years before this university could conceive of a regular tenured full-time professor doing that kind of a class. And so, John, I'm sorry, but you'll need to retire your professorship unless you want to be on the ground in LA for most of the days a week when you're teaching.
Wow.
Now, of course, if I'd waited, the timing's everything, right? I would have been remote a few months later. But the idea is that's the kind of shift we've made. And I think there's an equally interesting shift toward the new work operating system here. So new work arrangements is one. And then priorities like diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, sustainability. Those often become, this is everybody's job, in which case it's nobody's job. And so to be able to make those things into projects, perhaps let people volunteer, gives you a better structure than saying, well, do we have to write a job description or create a whole unit that is about that priority? So first step, if I'm consulting with you, let's talk about where already there's energy in your organization. Maybe the energy is in the form of frustration, but maybe just aspirations about being better, but something is getting in the way. Okay, that will give us the spot where we'll go. There's already energy. Now we're going to give that energy a language, a framework, this new work operating system, free people up from having to think about this has got to end up in a job, and just let them play with the pieces and match the pieces and reconfigure them. In fact, and then I'll give you a chance to get a word in, Jeannie. The other thing is you can look around and see where it's already starting. So skills-based systems are already a deconstruction framework. So instead of job holders, we're going to think of people as an array of skills in this case. Instead of a job, we're going to think of work as an array of things that use skills. So I'm delighted at the emergence of skills as a concept and a language, both within HR, but really among leaders outside of HR. Those skills-based systems are teaching them how to think in a deconstructed way. I think skills as a particular unit of analysis may eventually present some problems, but basically a skill is different from what someone can do. But that aside, you may already be experimenting with this. The other one is internal talent marketplaces offered by all kinds of companies around now. And that's a platform where people can post projects and volunteer for projects. Again, you're already doing this if you're doing internal talent marketplaces. So sometimes we start there to harness the skills system, the talent marketplace as a way to begin to show people that to teach them about this new work operating system now in the context of something they're already doing.
I love it. It brings so much relevance to what companies are trying to figure out right now. And think everybody is consistently saying, look, our old hierarchical system, it's very limiting, and it's old. It's old school.
Mm-hmm.
It's not going to infuse this breath of fresh air and this innovation and this excitement and enthusiasm that companies are looking for to help fuel them to the next iteration. And I also love what you said in that it's not an overhaul. It's starting with, where are you seeing movement already? Where are you even stuck and or have questions? Start there. And it's so much of what you're talking about, it's a mindset shift. So
Yes.
If you start to think about it differently, you'll start to be much more open to, what does this actually mean? What is it we're actually trying to solve for? And maybe the traditional way that we're going to tackle this is not the best idea.
Right. Yeah. And maybe a better, I love that. I think that's exactly right, Jeannie. One way to, and one way maybe to frame that question is it possible that our traditional structures are holding us back? Something like that. So not that they're not great, not that they're not fit to purpose for some ways of working. However, let's offer you the opportunity and to go back. And it's let me return to the operating system metaphor, because I think operating systems are kind of invisible, right? If you think about your computer operating system, and that's part of the reason why this is difficult, and part of the reason we called it an operating system. So in the days when I started working with computers in the 70s, they filled up a room and you had to go to the room. And the computers were set up so that you would essentially give them a set of cards that had machine language holes punched in them. And those cards had commands. And you'd give them the cards and it would do that job. And then you'd go wait in line for your printout to see if your sorting algorithm actually worked. And then the person next to you or behind you would do their job. Okay, so one job at a time was the way those computers worked. Now, today, you've got a laptop or a phone, and it appears to be able to do many things simultaneously. I won't even ask our viewers how many other things they've got open at the moment. I'm sure this is the only thing on their screen, right? And it looks like you've got many processing units. One's running the spreadsheet, another one's running this video, another one's running your word processing. There's a scheduling thing going on in the background, mail, et cetera. Turns out, that's only one. There's still only one processor. One source of work is available in the computer. But the genius is that someone figured out how to divide that CPU into nanoseconds of work and then allow the CPU to make decisions about how to prioritize. So it learns that if you're focused on this video, it moves some CPU time more over to that, especially if you start typing in the chat or something like that. If you then turn over to your mail, it moves some processing over there, keeps the video going, but what it's doing is taking the work, it has deconstructed it down to the nanoseconds, and those nanoseconds can flow to wherever they're needed. Yeah, very different, right? So to us, we just get used to a very fluid way of working, many apps open at once. But the fundamental thing that went on was that shift from a one job at a time design for computer work to a nanosecond divided CPU. And that's a good metaphor for what Robin and I are getting at in Work Without Jobs, rather than saying, well, I can't do any work until I've got a job ready for a job holder. Would it help us to change your mind and say, what if I could just take the work pieces and imagine that they could be done by someone who was qualified? Then you're free to say, would they reconfigure back into that job? Maybe they would. Great. Or no, they don't reconfigure back into that job. They reconfigure to something more like a mix, maybe of contractors and employees or automation and employees. But I hope I'm giving the idea that that operating system shift is almost invisible in the background, but once you do it, it enables so much more.
My brain immediately went to, so the traditional way, let's say you have open positions, right? What's the traditional way you ask for dollars or budgeting to go out and recruit? You create a job description, you compare your, this is my current head count, this is my additional ask for head count, this is how much it's going to cost, these are the levels, this is the hierarchy, this is the role, this is how it's tied to the strategy. You get yay or nay, then you go out, you get the talent, it's expensive, onboarding, all of that, instead of saying, hold on a minute. What's the business need? What is it we're trying to solve for? Who's here? Right. What are their skills? Right. What are their attributes that we could connect with and position them for it? Like, I literally just went, oh my goodness. Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
That is wild. And I was just thinking of the other thought, which is, you said something to me when we were preparing for this, and I wanted you to expand upon it because it's right in line with that sort of hierarchical thinking. We talked about those companies that think they have a positive culture because they're financially fit. Mm-hmm. So say more about that.
Well, so yeah, and it was a really interesting conversation, I think. So let's see where to begin with it. So culture is, number one, culture is very different from financial performance. And certainly some can say that culture may be correlated with financial performance, but that's certainly not the same thing as saying, if we're performing well financially, therefore we must have a good culture. So that's one thing, is the idea that they're not the same thing. The other thing we talked about was there's a good deal of evidence coming out, and I think, and it's true evidence that shows what I would call a correlation, in that organizations that are doing well financially also often have a culture that's measured as being better, whether it's Great Place to Work or Gallup or whatever internal engagement survey you do. It is not unusual at all to find that companies that perform better financially rate higher on lots and lots of things. Now, part of that is probably that there's something about engagement and high Great Place to Work scores, et cetera, that actually does contribute to better financial performance. Probably some of that's going on. Mm-hmm. But the other thing is that when people are working for a company that's doing well financially, they tend to believe that things are good. And so the financial performance itself can often make people feel like they're part of a winner, et cetera, and kind of in their minds say, well, yeah, I must be pretty engaged with my work because we're doing really well. On the other hand, if you're in a company that's having a hard time, and I say, are you engaged with your work? You may say, gosh, do I really want to identify with that? I'm not sure I am. So it's a combination of understanding that those are two very distinct things, that there's a fairly complex set of connections that's needed to happen between culture and something like financial performance. And then finally, there may be what we call in the social sciences reverse causation, meaning that it's not always culture leading to financial performance, but sometimes the other way. And of course, to study that last thing, you've got to do something that's very hard. You've got to change the culture and then watch and see if financial performance changes. That's very difficult to do.
Yeah.
So what we rely on, and I'm as guilty of this as anybody, is we kind of correlate the financial performance and the culture at a point in time and hope that what we're picking up may tell us something about what one thing leads to another.
Well, as an extension of the culture conversation, we also talked about what would it be like if, while we're all very accustomed to reporting on our financial metrics and transactional performances and our bottom line, what if we reported upon our people success as part of our communication and updates. So say more about that.
Thank you for that one too. And I think part of my job and one of the best things that I am here that I do is that I get out of the way and connect people to others who are much smarter than me and much better than me. I've already mentioned Robin J. Suthasan. So one of the takeaways from this should be not so much about me, but about go look up Robin. I'm going to mention another name now, and that name is Pete Ramstad, Ramstad. Pete and I wrote a book called Beyond HR back in 2007 with Harvard Business School Press. And some of those ideas continue to percolate up, and we're very blessed and privileged to have people be fans. So this idea is part of something that I'm working on with Pete. Now, Pete wrote this book with me, Beyond HR, and then became a head of HR in 2 publicly traded companies. One of my favorite things that Pete tells me about that he did, and I'm probably going to make it a little more apocryphal here, but it really did happen. Pete got agreement with the CEO that whenever a unit manager does an operating review, maybe they're quarterly, sometimes monthly if things are really going on, but that manager is going to stand up and they're going to report on the performance of their unit. And they're almost always required to report on how they made decisions about money, technology, other kinds of assets, right? So here you come in your operating review, you know you're going to report on that. There are pretty good frameworks to report on that. Pete's genius was to say, let's have them report on their talent numbers too. So imagine we're going to measure everybody's turnover, and every quarter, in addition to reporting on your cash flow, your sales, your revenue, your technology investments, we're going to put everybody's turnover number up there, and you're going to have to say what that number means. And why is your turnover 3 times higher than this other unit in the company? And you're going to report that to the board or whoever else you report in your operating review. Well, you can just imagine. And of course, we'll get Pete on here one of these days, and he can tell the story better than I. But as you would imagine, lots of resistance, lots of fear. What are you doing? That makes me look bad. Well, if you're talented like Pete was, it can become a virtuous cycle, not just a big argument. So if you commit to saying, I understand, some of these measures are imperfect, just like measures of finance, just like measures in technology. Let's think about it. Why do you think that, let's say, turnover isn't measuring the right thing? And someone will say, a lot of those people who left were people that we needed to get out of the way. And so I should get credit for sort of opening up positions for the new talent that we need. Very valid point sometimes. So Pete would say, great, let's change our turnover measure. Let's score turnover based on whether it's good or bad for the strategy in your unit. And let's report that. And now let's see how those discussions go. Well, obviously, in a very not so subtle way, your leaders begin to want to be students of these talent issues. They want to learn how to think about talent. I would say that's part of what Robin and I are trying to produce in our book, is a way of thinking that's different from jobs and job holders and degrees. To not so much to impose a new system or to deliver something or something like that, but to teach leaders, workers, and others how to think better about the work relationship, how to make better decisions about people, which is the fundamental premise of the book that Pete and I did. So these leaders, as you change the way we measure turnover, maybe you change the way we measure engagement, in response to them learning how those measures actually connect with what they're trying to accomplish. So that's this idea that it's not about great analytics only. It's maybe even more about how those analytics are used and teach people outside of HR to think better. And so
it's unbelievable because it would reveal 2 big things. Number 1, am I an organization that's transactionally oriented or people oriented?
Yep.
Because often it's really measuring the bottom line and oh, by the way, you also have to be a good people leader.
Yep.
And then the second thing, it would certainly reveal if I'm a good leader or not a good leader.
Yes.
I might be doing a great job meeting my quota, meeting the financial expectations of my scope and my role, but am I growing and evolving my people? that's why I had to put it in this conversation, because it's such a fascinating and like,
Yeah.
and it also leads me to my next question. So when you think about this work that you and Raven are doing with these operating systems, you mentioned a few in your book, DHL and Genentech.
Mhm.
Tell us a little bit in terms of examples of like how is this really impacting them as organizations, and any other examples that come to mind.
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to. We'll throw a few out there and see kind of how this works. So you mentioned DHL and Genentech. The DHL example would be a typical one of automating a physical distribution center, something like that. And so, the automation is here to stay. Automation is actually accelerating with COVID. So here comes a robot that can pack and pick things, and it stands at one spot, but a human used to do that. And so what do we do about the person doing the work? And that's where you really see, well, wait a minute, I can't just remove them. This has actually created other work that needs to be done. The easy ones are, well, somebody's got to maintain the robot or something like that. It's easy, but it's true, but that's, so how do I reconfigure the work of this person from standing in a spot, picking and packing, to maybe being the person who helps maintain the robot? Okay, but then the robots start to move. Well, and they can pick things up and take them to another place. Okay, now what does the human work look like? Well, one might be there's certain finesse things that have to happen in the packing process, and those still need to be done by a human. But now I need you to flow to where the robotic system is creating bottlenecks because it needs a human hand, maybe to pack or to check something. Of course, the next one would be looking outward. We start to have a personless distribution center. All the road. Now, does that mean that the people are gone? We've replaced them. That's kind of the apocalyptic view. But very often what you see is a great number of those people have moved to some kind of a control center. And all those great human insights they had about how things move, about efficiencies, et cetera, now they can see the whole thing, and they can work more like air traffic controllers. There's another example from a previous book, the book on automation, where Robin and I talked about neighbors and others that were automating oil rigs. And so the old system, you've got a bunch of people, they're on a rig out in the North Sea or on land or whatever, and they're the people that will do the repairs and the maintenance and everything should something need to happen. All humans, right? You've all seen them, big hazmat suits, et cetera. If you're if you're on a North Sea one, it includes divers that go down underneath and repair stuff. Okay. Robots suddenly can do a lot of that work. It's like, now if a robot does it, it's less dangerous, often more efficient. So now a robot can do the repair, et cetera. What do we need the people for? Well, we can say we automated the rig, and that's what the headlines say. But if you go look carefully, the people didn't go away. What they did was they moved to a control center, often on land, often in a more comfortable spot. There's a huge diversity of people now that can help with this job, perhaps people with different abilities, who may not be able necessarily to climb or walk or whatever, people with less physical prowess, et cetera. And those same people that were on the rig, if you've got a talented repair person who was great at figuring out this thing, well, it used to be they were confined to one rig. And so, yeah, if that problem happened on that rig, you were in great shape. If it happened on another rig, you might have someone who wasn't as good. It's like reading an X-ray, or something like that. When you can deconstruct that work, when you can let that work become more fluid, like in a control center, now the human insight about that repair problem, you can go right to the person that's best at it. Same thing with banking, where you pull out the teller who was stuck in one spot, and you take that great teller, you put them on a portal, and they can move to the customer that best needs their help. So that kind of thing begins, you start with a distribution center, and then you say, well, wait a minute, this idea of letting the work flow, letting people move to the work, that could really apply lots of places. Genentech, kind of similar. Genentech was one that's become pretty common now. They had their let's call it their IT folks dedicated to departments, IT for sales, IT for HR, IT for finance, et cetera. They observed there's differences in demand. Sometimes finance needs a lot and HR isn't really using theirs, et cetera, right? And so to better use that resource, they change the nature of the work to create a pool of IT folks that can flow to the places where they're needed. And the new job and the new leadership dilemma is not to supervise the IT people in your department, but now to have an IT group that can set priorities, that can flow to the work, et cetera. So those two are kind of two of my favorites about letting people flow to the work. And very often, they ended up, Jeannie, with people still having jobs, right?
Wow.
So you have a job in a control center, not a job standing on an oil rig. So it's not so much necessarily work without jobs, but to see the pattern and to reconstruct it required giving up those old job descriptions and opening your mind to a job description that might look more like a control center instead of a job to stand on a rig and wait to repair it.
The other thing I was just thinking about with those examples, how do you see this impacting a typical hierarchical structure? I'm the MD. These are the executive directors. These are the vice presidents. I'm just using a financial services model. These are the managers. This is my emerging talent. These are my analysts. How does this impact that?
It's a pretty big impact. And again, I just love it, your questions, because they let me bring to the fore so many of the collaborators I've been blessed with. So one of the people who read this book is a gentleman named Jonathan Donner. I met Jonathan when he was the head of executive development and talent development at Unilever. That was back in the early 2000s that we did most of our work together. And since then, Jonathan has worked for the UK Health Group, et cetera. And Jonathan is now semi-retired, and we've been talking about this, and he was kind enough to read a manuscript of the book. Okay. So the way Jonathan tells the story is his first reaction, because he spent his life thinking about leaders and leadership and the evolution of leadership. And he said, boy, this is tectonic. You just as you described, the old world is I'm a leader and I know who I lead because I have these lines that emanate. I have a box, and that box is my job on a org chart. And then from the org chart, there are these lines, and those lines connect to other boxes. And those boxes have names in them and job descriptions. And those are the boxes of the people that I lead. And I know I have those people and I lead them. And then when someone takes a job in those boxes, I lead those new people. And if they pursue a career, they leave my box and they move to another box, and then they have a new lead. And so we all know who we lead by the lines flowing to the boxes. And it's kind of episodic. I performance reviews once a year. I pay attention to diversity, equity, and inclusion all the time, but I change my diversity representation numbers when I have an opening, that kind of thing. My brand as a leader is pretty much the people in those boxes. I'm not that well known, nor do I have to really think about the others around me. And the other leaders, kind of to take it to extreme, they lead their own way, And we get together when people need to move between positions, make sure nobody's hoarding talent, et cetera. So that's old system. New system, let's just take one more example just to start the conversation. Suppose you put in one of these talent marketplaces. Lots of companies, Gloat, Eightfold, Workday, everybody has something like that. And one of the ones we talk about in the book is Unilever, so I'll use that example. Unilever tells some of its leaders, you're not going to get a job requisition, but you can post parts of the job as projects. And so they do, and they put those projects on the platform. Unilever tells its employee group, not all of them, but an experimental group, you're going to be able to look at those projects and take them on based on anything you want, all voluntary. And much to my surprise, and I've said this publicly, if someone had asked me if I thought that would work, I would say, no way. Why are people going to volunteer for stuff in the company they're getting paid to do? They already have a full-time job. Well, it turns out one of the great stories out of Unilever is a person in the financial group, fine job, loved their work, began to see projects in diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. They began to do those projects. Well, over time, that group got to know them, they pursued their passion, and they moved from a job in finance to a job in that group. Okay, now let's think about the interim. Here you are as a leader, and you learn that your people are volunteering to work with other leaders on a
Yeah.
project? Like, didn't they have enough to do? And you know, and the CEO of Unilever presented this to his investor call and said, we've found hundreds and thousands of quote unquote hidden hours where our people are quite willing to volunteer, not for money, but for a sense of purpose, to develop a new skill, to show off a skill or capability that they don't show off in their job, et cetera. Turns out it's a massive attractor. It's a massive attractor for leaders who are looking for an alternative to having to do a job requisition to get work done. So real successful, Jonathan read it and said, this is a tectonic change in how leaders need to think. And we wrote an article about this in the Sloan Management Review. Among other things, the idea is that you're now leading not in an episodic way, but in a very fluid way. You may see 100 different people instead of just the 20 that report to you. As you post these projects, as people move through your team on a temporary, voluntary basis, your leadership brand will be on display maybe 10 or 100 times more often as this fluid system moves people through you. On the one hand, if you've got great leaders that have good values, that can articulate a sense of purpose, that have a common way of seeing the organization, this thing can be a terrific accelerator of good culture, of common understanding. If you have leaders that are not particularly purpose-led, that are exuding the wrong values, that tend to be insular in their thinking about talent, I own you, et cetera, that's also going to become very public, very quick, and can become a reinforcer. So these systems open up the chance for positive acceleration, but also, if things go wrong, negative acceleration, which is, in a sense, a kind of existential challenge for organizations. How would your leaders stack up if their brand was now public to 100 times more people around here? You know, really interesting question for an imperative, right? How are your leaders going to get together to think of themselves as sort of shepherding a whole array of workers that may move in and out of projects with them? That might mean 10 leaders need to get together and say, how are we going to do this? How do we set priorities? When am I allowed to say no? They can't do your project because I need them, right? And when how do I know when I'm saying that too often and the system won't work? These have always been issues at some level, you know, in any system where leaders need to move talent between them, et cetera. But in a job-based system, I think we have almost the crutch of being able to say, I know I'm a good leader when I lead my employees, the ones that report to me. And this sort of, if you ever had any doubt that you were actually a leader of a much broader array of talent, this new fluid system will bring that to the fore.
Wow. The word that was going through my mind was communal.
Yes. Very good word. Yep.
It really takes the idea of, you know, team spirit. We're all in this together to the next level. Like, really? Are we really in this together? And so the problem then is we're getting all this amazing talent, incredible work done, but we're not quite sure who's in charge. Like,
right.
But again, going back to what you said in the beginning, it's not a blow up. You start with where the energy points are and you start to tool with it, using, even if you just adopted this mindset in how you think about that energy center, it could open up many of the things that you just shared.
Very well put. And that's how almost everything I've described would be what I would call an experiment, sometimes pretty large scale. But almost everything I've described is something that is positioned in a way that we are going to try it where there's a lot of energy, where it matters a lot, and where it's likely that the experiment will reveal things that are going to be really valuable. Unilever did not open up this internal talent marketplace to everyone. And so it's sort of focused on places where they thought a project-based approach might make sense. They developed a new product in record time, for example. The idea being there's probably a lot of people around here who have a great perspective on our new products. We probably need a combination of operations and finance and marketing and HR and others. There's no job like that. Let's create a project and allow people to flow to it. Same thing with, let's do it in our distribution center. Let's do it on our oil rigs. That doesn't mean let's do it in this call center, that kind of thing. Let's do it where we have dilemmas about hybrid remote. That's a big one today. So we know there's energy there. We know there's frustration very often. Would this way of thinking, could we break the work up and say, what tasks can be done remotely? What need to be on site? How could we be flexible? And then if I may, so this sounds like experiments, and it is. And so another message that I'm sort of working on now for the HR world and for leaders generally is to approach work the way you would have approached software and product design, with agile tools, with customer involvement. So today, in the world of software, we're all completely accustomed to the idea that software you use is constantly obsolete and constantly being upgraded. Your phone's upgrading right now. Your computer will upgrade in a few minutes. And those upgrades happen in part because folks like you and I find stuff that we hate. And we either tell the company directly in a feedback, or the AI can see watching us use it, right? So software for decades transferred from a model that said, we're going to take it, we're going to carefully create it, we're going to develop it, we're going to discover a need, develop, test, deploy. Once it's deployed, no going back. It's called a waterfall. Can't go up the waterfall. And our job now is to sell it to you. You have a complaint? Let's convince you you're probably not right and that this is still pretty good. Same thing with products, et cetera. So we have the transformation was, let's be agile. Let's do that cycle of discover, develop, test, deploy 4 or 5 times a year, maybe. And let's engage the customer so that a complaint is no longer something we have to convince that the person is wrong. The complaint is information about how our next cycle might improve the product. Is it chaos? Does it mean that we're constantly throwing the product out and putting it back? No, we systematically choose where we experiment in the places where we think there's the greatest payoff and the greatest learning. And some areas of the product or software we don't change right now. So imagine if we substituted the word work for software and the word worker for customer, and we approached work design with the same rigor and the same science that you're already using when you build software, when you create new products. Why isn't work worthy? Why shouldn't work be worthy to be elevated to that level of attention, rigor, and experimentation? And then wouldn't I love it if the HR profession could become so good at that work design, agile work design process, that it was the hub for the learnings, the hub for the discoveries, the place where the priorities are set, the place that listens to the workers and takes all that information, all those transactions, translates it into a plan for improving work, so that the deal with your workers and your leaders is, our starting point of our work policy is, we don't know. We don't know what the future is. We don't know how work is going to evolve. It is, let's just be honest. Anybody who says they know can't possibly be correct, and it's just accelerating. Does that mean chaos? No, it's the same thing as saying, I don't know what software features are going to be key in 5 years, and no one does. But that doesn't mean we're lost. It doesn't mean it becomes random. And it certainly doesn't mean you have to revert to say, please, let's have a concrete policy, like 3 days a week at work, and then we can move on. That would be like saying, I just want to put this software out there for 3 years and go convince people that it's fine. It sounds ridiculous.
Wow. My brain just like,
You're very kind.
And I'm thinking of people that in my sphere that would challenge you and really push back on what you're saying, because they come from very traditional, and we've all been conditioned to behave and operate within systems that we've grown up in. Right now, you're also speaking to a lot of the new generation that's coming into the workplace is going to really connect with a lot of the language because they're very, very purpose driven. But I would love for you to share with us, like, the types of challenge and the pushback that you get on this, and how do you address it?
Thank you. That's a great question, Jeannie. And so so a couple of things come up, and I think they're all legitimate. So I think they all emanate not from a position of a calcified, closed mind at all. And at least I very seldom encounter folks like that. I'm sure they're out there. Some very prominent CEOs appear to be that way, frankly. However, most of it is very from a standpoint of a growth mindset, et cetera. So here we go. One of them is if we implement this system, it's going to create chaos in our organization. And I think the answer there is, well, let's go where the chaos has already been created. Leave alone those parts of your organization where you don't need this. Jobs are working fine, et cetera. We've talked about the triggers. I'm going to suggest you already have chaos there trying to use the old system. So let's at least go in and see what happens if we teach them this one and what they come up with. Okay, so the future is unevenly distributed is a real important mantra to start in. The change process here could be start where you've already got energy, maybe in the form of frustration. So that's one. If we tried to switch off our job system, switch on your new work operating system, it's going to create chaos. And I would agree, it's probably unnecessary in a lot of places. So experiment where it's going to make sense. The other one, and this is legitimate, again, it's very hard to integrate into our current systems, which use jobs as the unit for pay, as the unit to anchor someone, and are you a member or not, as the unit of what are you learning, what do you know, et cetera. Careers, hiring, pay, the whole talent life cycle is often built around job. And, we know you work here because you have an employment contract. The thing you do, we know because it's in this job description. I don't think anyone thinks that system is really perfect or that it really reflects all of the things someone can do or all the work that they do. But it's true that that integration is key. And to be honest, I think that is a challenge that, smarter people than me will address. How do we pay people when they're floating between projects? Right now, the experiment is make it voluntary. As I said, I wouldn't have predicted it would have worked so well, but it has. I also think that they'll very quickly, and a lot of the organizations I'm talking to about those are saying our next challenge, and it needs to happen pretty fast, is to integrate that marketplace into our other systems, track the capabilities. That's a fairly straight, not easy, but one that's already being done. Let's let AI bring the skills someone shows in a project into their formal list of capabilities. Pay is harder. Pay systems are oriented around a job, and most of the pay anchoring and the pay leveling systems presume you find a job that's similar. Is it possible to pay based on the parts of a job? Absolutely. Freelance platforms have done it forever. Consulting firms do it. Contractors do it. So it's not that the systems aren't out there, but it's a very legitimate point that the current systems inside organizations are not really oriented to paying you on the basis of a project. So let's look to places that have built systems like that. In the book, we write a little bit about consulting. Robin's got much more experience than me. And he said, John, in most consulting firms, it's a human that is doing this integration, across projects, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a legitimate one. And I think a really good challenge for the HR profession, for HR technology, is how do we begin to create HR systems, pay, hiring, capability, or learning, et cetera, that reflect this fluidity. Skills is an interesting beginning in the world of learning. And then another thing that I'll do is just, let's keep this quiet, I guess is the way I'd say it. Let's step back and not tell anyone we're thinking about this. And let's have a meeting, maybe we do it in an offsite for HR. And let's bring a case study or two in and quietly and privately pretend that you could use a framework that didn't depend on jobs, job holders, and degrees. Where might that solve a problem for you? And then you lead.
Love
then
that.
you go in, right?
I love that. Stealth.
Yeah, stealthy. I think HR often underestimates the power of its own community. And again, this is something Pete has spoken and written eloquently about, that when you're in HR, you are a citizen of your profession of HR, not only a representative of HR to a business unit or to your professional center of expertise like learning or pay or something like that. You're a citizen of HR here. And so let's bring ourselves together as citizens and let's do a simulation where we experiment with a new idea and develop it here before we take it out on Broadway, so to speak. That you can see how that culture of experimentation, agile experimental tools applied to work design is coming through a lot of what I'm saying. And that's another starting point is, could we use this as the beginning of a culture that experiments with work just as rigorously as with software or new pharmaceuticals or new products, et cetera. And then the final one is, sometimes I can find, this idea of you're working with a unit of analysis, but you could do more if you could see inside it. I think about textbooks on biology. And I haven't done it lately, but if you go back and look at the textbooks that I learned on, in the 60s and 70s, and look at the diagram of a cell in those books, I mean, really, it was a pretty clunky set of really big things. Well, now, if you look, those things have elements. They've been broken down. And we begin to know, for example, that the cure for diseases is based on the folding, the folding of the cure against the geometric folding of the disease and how they fit together. Very different from when we said, well, we're going to have you swallow this and we'll see if you get better. So sometimes I find, particularly with engineers and scientists and others, they already get the metaphor. That, like, I was working with a pet food company and I said, look, what I'm saying is, if you had a world where all you could do to create pet food was have bone and meat and grain, well, you can create pet foods that way and you can combine those things that way. If I let you see the nutrients underneath each of those, it's a much more complex world. At first you go, oh my goodness, how am I going to keep track of all this? But of course, now we know, if you can understand the nutrients, the options about creating pet food are immensely more interesting and more optimizable, so to speak, than if I only had bone, grain, and meat. And so that very often that's my entry point, Jeannie, is to sort of, and this is true of a lot of my work, I want to find where leaders are already smart. Like, you're already smart when it comes to chemistry, when it comes to pet food. Let me engage that smart part of your brain and then hold on to it. All I'm saying is, substitute work for food, substitute jobs for meat, grain, bone, and substitute parts of jobs for nutrients. So again, that's kind of, I found that to be pretty successful. Leaders are really smart about a lot of things. They just haven't been held accountable to be that smart about talent and work.
What a beautiful way to end this conversation. The word nutrients, the visual of nutrients, means so much to this conversation because it really gives the brain the ability to visualize what's really going on underneath. Like, what are the cells that are making up the whole?
Yes.
I am so thrilled to have met you and that you are doing this work in the world, you and Raven, and it's so important. So anybody who is thinking about even playing a little bit with the edges of their organizations needs to read this book, reach out to you, have more dialogue. We will meet again. We will be continuing this conversation.
I can't wait.
Thank you for joining me for another episode of the Warriors at Work show. If you are interested in learning more about what we do at the Warriors at Work show and platform, be sure to go over to my website, Jeannie Coomber, and subscribe to my monthly Warrior Playbook newsletter. I share everything that I'm up to month by month, as well as some lessons and insights that I've learned. I'm also interested in hearing any feedback you have about this conversation or future topics. So reach out to me directly on jc@jeanniecoomber.com or on LinkedIn. Be sure to tell your friends and your colleagues about this Warriors at Work conversation. Subscribe, review, and rate us. It's the best way to get this message out into the world. Be well.